Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen podcast for investors interested in Indigenous investment in Canada. Born from the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit, the show focuses on the nexus of Indigenous economic strategies and investment opportunities. I am Mark Magnacca, and my co-host Robert Brant today discuss the proposed launch of the Centre for Indigenous Corporate Partnerships, an initiative led by Boston Consulting Group based on their work over the years in Australia. Join us as we explore how these crucial conversations impact economic development within Indigenous communities in Canada and beyond. Hello, Rob. Great to see you today. And I guess it's good morning because you're on the other side of the pond.
That's right. Hi, Mark. Sago. I'm back in Toronto, spending more and more of my time here, it seems.
Great. You went for the sun, did you? Because we've had, two weeks of no sun, and was reported it's, 50% less than we had last October, November.
Yeah, no, I found it here and amongst the Swifties, because that's the biggest news in Toronto at the moment.
Oh, the concert's coming up, is it?
She's in town.
Oh, okay. Here, I thought you were working. Are you going?
No. Unfortunately, I don't have tickets for this one.
Okay. Well, anyway, I guess it's great to be back there. And, we share a hockey team. I think we're both Toronto Maple Leaf fans.
Absolutely.
They've won a few games. Winnipeg's been burning up the league. But as we know, regular season doesn't count if you're a Maple Leaf fan, right?
Definitely does not.
Good. So when you've been over in Toronto, I understand you've been at a couple of conferences or events talking about the Indigenous world and investment.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the Energy Roundtable conference yesterday, an annual gathering in Toronto. Senior energy executives and stakeholders, always a very good conference.
Yes, and that was primarily Canadian energy producers or North American?
Yeah, no, most of the focus is on Canada for sure.
Okay. And what were some of the issues coming up related?
Well, I really enjoyed Chief Crystal Smith's presentation and discussion. You remember we spoke to her
of course.
A couple months ago.
Yes, Cedar LNG. Fantastic.
Yeah, and so she was providing an update. Work is proceeding at pace on the Cedar LNG project.
Okay, good.
And so still a lot of good things happening out in British Columbia.
Good, and more people seeing that as an example of how to make progress.
Yeah, and you saw that on a number of the panels, and then very senior executive CEO level types, and all talking about the importance of their Indigenous partnerships.
Right.
And a recognition that those sorts of partnerships are the way forward, and talking about the benefits that come from those partnerships, and statements about future intent, and the fact that a lot of these energy producers, distributors, and other stakeholders are not going back to the days when big projects could get done without Indigenous involvement.
Yes, and I'm sure it was a subject of discussion at the conference with President-elect Trump, and a focus on unburdening the oil and gas industry with regulations in the U.S. Were there any implications, perceived for the role of the Indigenous peoples in Canadian oil and gas industry, and how that's going to affect with things south of the border? Because we basically almost have a common market in terms of energy in North America.
Yeah, and there was some suggestion that there have been discussions already with President-elect Trump's team, his transition team, and some thoughts on what their energy policy might be. Some suggestions that they would like to see a North American energy policy and a superpower created with at least the US and Canada. When you add up production in oil and gas between the two countries, it accounts for something like 25% of, I think it's global production.
Yes.
And so if the two countries ever worked together with a common policy, that would be a really influential force in the global market.
Well, given that oil and gas was included in the the free trade originally between Canada, the US, and NAFTA. And it was obviously there would be no differentiation in pricing in two markets. What are some of the other barriers that remain between the two countries? I wasn't familiar there actually was that many.
It's not so much barriers as it is differences in approaches and differences in regulation and policy. And if they could coordinate, and there's some suggestion that the Trump administration is or will put some pressure on Canada to come alongside and follow its plan to deregulate, to make approvals processes easier, to try to streamline permitting processes. And if Canada and US worked in lockstep, then that would create a North American superpower in energy.
Yes.
To rival some of the other energy blocks.
Well, I don't think anyone doesn't expect pressure to be applied if that's where President-elect Trump wants to go. And, they are Canada's biggest trading partner. And, we always talk about our American cousins because we share a lot and we share the continent and the resources cross borders, right? It's hard to tell where the border stops sometimes unless you're flying over a plane and you've seen somebody's cut down a bunch of trees and that tells you where the border is. But given that objective from President Trump, or what we think is an objective in terms of this energy superpower in North America, what is the impact the Indigenous peoples are seeing from that? Because by the very nature of economic reconciliation in Canada, they have a seat at the table now.
Yeah, so how that plays out, everybody bemoans the lengthy approvals processes and permitting processes, and everybody would like to streamline it, and there are lots of attempts to streamline. The fact is, in Canada, these projects will not get built, developed without Indigenous consent. I think is fair to say now. It's not just without some consultation. I think it's consent and material involvement, and sometimes that takes time to get the Indigenous communities on side.
Correct. And how about some of the Indigenous communities south of the border? Do they see what is happening in Canada as something they can learn from and progress with in the U.S.? I think that this has to be one of the key policy challenges to have an energy superpower in North America, because it's now the law of the land in Canada.
It is. The courts in Canada have backed up Indigenous claims and Indigenous rights in recent years. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples gradually being adopted across Canada, and Indigenous communities across Canada standing up and saying we're not going to allow development in, around, near, through our territories without a meaningful say. In the States, I don't think they have as strong court case law to stand behind, and we are seeing instances of those U.S. tribes calling us in Canada and wanting to understand more about the way we're doing things now, and wanting to take more of a material involvement and equity stake in some of their developments in a way that they haven't historically.
Interesting. Well, I guess it's a space that we'll be watching very closely as President-elect takes office in January, and what will be the impact on energy and all kinds of other areas. And, given that Canada is very much a commodity-driven economy, that's obviously, we're going to be very focused on that as we go into 2025. I also understand you were at another conference at BCG, Boston Consulting Groups, or it was a meeting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a workshop. BCG, to their credit, have started an initiative in Canada based on something they have rolled out in Australia over the last 20 years. And that is an initiative that involves the non-Indigenous corporate world, in this case, corporate Canada, getting together and supporting by providing pro bono services to Indigenous communities across Canada to help with economic and social initiatives. And so BCG and a couple of others, Jay Wright from Artera Wines, now retired or rewired, as he says, Chief Clarence Louis of the Soyuz Band in British Columbia.
Yes.
Brad Baker at BCG founded something they're calling the Center for Indigenous Corporate Partnerships. And like I say, it's modeled on something that BCG have done in Australia for over 20 years. And over that time helped more than, well, it's into the hundreds of Indigenous communities in Australia garner some support in corporate Canada to establish this center. And it was a really interesting gathering. They had maybe 40 people together, bankers, Indigenous leaders,
Yes.
and others interested, professional service advisories folks, and some big names involved from the banks, First Nations. And so I was a part of that because I am interested in that myself, and we'll see if McCarthy Tatro will get involved.
Yes. And so just coming back, I think it's called the Center for Indigenous Corporate Partnerships, CICP.
That's right.
And in terms of the makeup, it's interesting. You were describing it was there. And like yourself, an Indigenous person representing the corporate world or coming from that world. Is that what you found for most of the corporate partners? That more and more the representatives who are working with the Indigenous communities are of Indigenous background themselves?
No, we're still a minority, but organizations in corporate Canada, they're all finding that this issue is rising in importance. They're dealing more and more with Indigenous communities across Canada. They're looking to hire. A lot of this is in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, especially for corporate Canada. And sadly, in the last week, we lost Senator Murray Sinclair, yes, who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation.
Yes, a great loss for all of Canada, and really took Canada on that journey of, leading through the Truth and Reconciliation process, which was initially modeled on South Africa's approach to apartheid. And he is famous throughout Canada, was very well respected, and was a very difficult time and process, but he was able to bring everyone together, united through that process. So that is obviously very, very sad.
It was very sad. I mean, I got to meet him once. I heard him speak a couple of times. Soft-spoken, matter-of-fact, straight talker. But when he spoke, people listened.
Yes.
And he had an integrity about him, almost in the way that Nelson Mandela did when he spoke. People listened, and Murray Sinclair was a lawyer and then a judge and a senator, somebody I always looked up to and respected. And so there were tributes across the country on his passing, which was way too soon. But his work lives on, and the path that he and the commission laid out and those calls to action live on. And this new center is in response to that call to action to corporate Canada to get involved and to do something.
Yes, and his firm was actually Cochrane Sinclair out of Manitoba, if I recall correctly. Is that?
Yes, I mean, he did so many things. He was a senior judge for many years, and then Canadian Senate, practicing lawyer, involved in notable decisions and cases, and throughout his career.
Yes, so a great loss to Canada, and I think Indigenous peoples around the world, because the influence of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee really set a standard in terms of the approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the work of that commission and the work that he and others continued to do after the commission reported to bring to light the issue of some of the past injustices that still have an effect today, and recommendations on how we can do better going forward. A lot of that work was very influential, and without it, I'm not sure we would have seen some of the initiatives we've seen in this space in recent years.
Okay, so a great name that will resonate through history. So, Rob, coming back to CICP, it sounds like a great gathering of different individuals there. And you mentioned earlier, BCG has done this in Australia. And it's kind of actually interesting because I think Canada is, in terms of now that it's the law of the land, is moving ahead, but these are great learnings brought over from Australia, where Indigenous rights have been an ongoing issue as well. So it's good to see that those best practices coming across. And
yeah, absolutely. It was an interesting group of people in the room and different companies and firms represented. We had everything from the banks I mentioned, RBC and Scotiabank were represented. I had the big marketing agency, the Asian group Dentsu. I had some great Canadian retail names like Canada Goose.
There you go. And, we had the banks, and we had that, and we had the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. So that's the business school I went to. So that's great to see them taking the leading role. And Queen's always had a reputation for, feeding Ottawa with thinkers on policy issues. So that's really good to see as well.
Yeah, they're one of the early founders of this group, helping BCG with the concept. So they are fully behind it, and their entrepreneurship school in particular is very excited about this initiative. So well done to Queen's.
Excellent. And so coming back to, who are the Indigenous participants that were there, the communities?
Some nations that were represented included the Hiawatha Nation, which is near Toronto, just east of Toronto, Constant Lake First Nation, Northern Ontario First Nation, and also the Cree from Northern Quebec. Two of their nations from Northern Quebec were represented. We also had Cedar Leaf Capital in the room.
Oh, the new firm that was just listed on the TSE.
Well, they just got regulatory approval. They're not a listed company, but they are now a regulated investment dealer. They're Indigenous owned.
Yes.
And majority Indigenous owned by 3 different First Nations groups. Got the Squamish from British Columbia, English River First Nation from Saskatchewan.
Excellent.
And Rama from Ontario. Those 3 First Nations, through their development corporations, are equal partners. And then Scotiabank has a 30% interest. Mm-hmm. And so Scotiabank has helped Cedar Leaf get off the ground. They're going to be an advisory service initially in capital markets, focused on debt capital markets.
Yes.
And their CEO, Clint Davis, who is an Inuk from Labrador. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
He was there, and a couple of his colleagues from Cedar Leaf were there as well. But I hope we can get Clint and maybe some of their shareholders on in a future podcast.
Yes, I'm sure. That's great. And what do they see as the priorities for CICP in terms of over the next year as they try and formulate this project, this initiative?
The initial priority is to get corporate Canada supportive and involved. And so up till now, it's been a small group of founders. I mentioned from BCG, Osler's Canadian law firm, also early involvement. And so now they're trying to spread the word and create a structure to facilitate the pro bono work different participants will be able to provide.
Okay.
The idea is to oversee that pro bono work, to work with communities, look at what those Indigenous communities need, and then provide from the network within the CICP the services that make most sense.
So I think they've had one pilot completed at Constance Lake First Nation, and there's another active pilot at the moment with the Hiawatha First Nation.
Yeah, in both of those, so Hiawatha and Constant Lake, both in Ontario, and both communities that needed some support developing strategic plans and had some other issues, needed the support and the expertise that CICP members could provide. And so BCG and some others provided some personnel who spent time in the communities helping develop and deliver some programs in economic development and in healthcare.
Great. So sounds like a strong initiative, and I guess they're focusing on building these partnerships in a way to channel the expertise of the corporate partners in support of Indigenous goals. What exactly are the benefits that they see as the value for communities coming from this?
for the communities themselves.
Yes.
Well, there's a lack of capacity in a lot of communities, not everyone, but so the communities are lacking in personnel who have this expertise. In a lot of the cases, they don't have the resources to buy that expertise yet. And so this partnership with CICP provides that people, provides the expertise, provides a place where local Indigenous people can learn alongside the experts from corporate Canada. So there's a bit of talent development that's a part of this, and then execution to get some things done.
Okay. And, how is this perceived by those Indigenous communities and nations who are in that group talking about? Because on one hand, this is corporate Canada who, hasn't had a great relationship with the Indigenous peoples over time. Once again, saying, oh, we'll come and help you, as opposed to develop their own capabilities and capacity. And you're in both places, Rob. You're a proud Mohawk, and you're sitting in one of the biggest law firms in Canada with McCarthy Tetrol. So is this seen as a positive initiative, or are they concerned that they're not there as equal partners?
Yeah, it's a delicate and sensitive issue. First of all, the CICP would only get involved when asked by a community to come in and help. So nobody is obligated to work with CICP. And when CICP members do get involved, it's going to have to be done in a very respectful way. And the idea is not for experts to come in and tell the local communities how things have to be done. There will be a period of education for whoever goes into a community, and they're going to have to understand a bit about that community and what the needs of that community are and what that community is trying to achieve, and then to work side by side and try to develop solutions together, and then to execute those solutions together. It will be done, has to be done, in a very cooperative, respectful way.
Yes, you can see the benefit that the corporate partners would get from that, from a way to take meaningful action on, I guess, what's referred to as the call to action 92. Okay, and I can see how within those corporates, certainly a lot of the younger people will see this as definitely what should be done to repair relations and strengthen economic relationship over time. So you can see a lot of winning points for corporate Canada for it. And we're going to have these difficult conversations, just as we're speaking earlier about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and the work that was done. This is an ongoing process in Canada.
Absolutely. From the corporates, from their perspective, and from CICP's perspective, the idea is to create long-term partnerships. So not coming into a community, telling them how they need to do things, and then leaving. The idea is, and the way it has worked in Australia, is that these are seen as long-term relationships and partnerships. And from those corporates being involved in this way, part of it is being good corporate citizen, part of it is self-interest, because as people are starting to appreciate, if the Indigenous economy in Canada does well, then
yes,
we're all going to benefit from that. From the corporate's perspective, it's also a way to build expertise and learn more about how to work with Indigenous communities. We talked about how this is a new space for a lot of them. And a lot of corporations believing that they're going to have to learn how to deal in a better way with Indigenous communities. So this is a learning and talent development tool for the corporates as well.
Yes.
I can see it as from our own perspective, from McCarthy's perspective, if we get involved, I can see that this would be a way to help recruit Indigenous lawyers and other staff if we're involved in this partnership initiative. I think it'll help us retain some employees who more and more want to see their organization be involved with some sort of social impact and wanting to believe that they're making a difference. And then it's also just good relationship building and networking amongst the corporates themselves who are all involved in sharing knowledge and know-how. Our firm, and I know many others, are involved in different initiatives already, providing pro bono services, providing funds for different causes, including Indigenous causes. But what makes CICP different, I think, is it's not just putting money into a cause, it's taking our skill set and our knowledge and know-how and our relationships and putting those to use.
Yes.
In a way that hopefully will benefit these Indigenous communities across Canada.
Yes, and I think, that engagement and learning of how to make this a success, and we come back to the earlier part of the call, we're talking about, energy superpower in North America. That would also empower everybody to, see this as a platform for success across the continent. Obviously the world's changing in terms of how America is going to approach the world and relationships. And I think this certainly gives, Canada a point of difference to contribute to the conversations in a meaningful way. And I think the development of the talent pool will be really, really important. So I think that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, if it works, it'll raise up some future Indigenous leaders. It'll improve the way the corporate Canada works with Indigenous communities.
Yes.
And that will benefit the Indigenous economy and the Canadian economy as a whole, not to mention the social benefits that come from improved economic conditions. One of the speakers yesterday and one of the early founders of this initiative, I mentioned Chief Clarence Louie from the Soyos tribe in British Columbia.
Yes.
Well known, amongst other things, for their very, very good wines. I would commend their wines to anybody out there.
Okay.
But Chief Louie talked about the economic horse has to pull the social cart.
Yes.
And improvement in our economic condition facilitate and improve the social conditions as well, and allows more social programs. And he made the point that in every Indigenous community, we should see more people involved in the economic arm of what's going on in their community. And they need more people involved in that than are involved in the social side.
Yes. As anywhere, and I think in particular in this issue to, really make economic reconciliation happen. Okay, so Rob, that's really sounds like you're having a very productive time back in Toronto with those two events and, different perspectives on the same issue about economic reconciliation. I'm sorry that you won't be able to get to this Taylor Swift conferences. Let's call it a conference. That's how you get it through. Okay, I need to go to this conference. Can this be, signed off? Anyway, I'm sorry you can't get to one of the concerts, but I'm sure Toronto is chock-a-block for the next week. But I think those are, great insights into how, economic reconciliation is progressing. So, it's not a question of if, it's happening today. You have corporate Canada line up. They know they have to deliver and be part of the solution to make things happen, because no better metaphor, the train's left the station. So if you're not on, those opportunities won't present themselves. And, the Indigenous peoples have suffered for long. So unless they've got willing partners, they're not going to bring along somebody who's unwilling. You just won't get to play the game. And you'll miss out on this significant economic opportunity that's really shaping the future of Canada.
Yeah. Well said, and nice talking to you, Mark. Looking forward to speaking to Chief Terry Paul next week.
Yes, that will be great as well. And look forward to catching up when you're back in London. And you can bring some of that wine you were talking about. Okay.
I'll do my best.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Today's discussion highlighted the Centre for Indigenous Corporate Partnerships, a new initiative in Canada inspired by BCG's work over the past decade in Australia. This initiative is aimed at developing connections between Indigenous businesses and major corporations, helping bridge economic gaps and create new opportunities. See you next time for more on impactful leadership and initiatives shaping Canada's Indigenous investment landscape. I'm Mark Magnacca. Thank you for listening.